One of the things that is frequently the cause of our art not working, especially when it comes to creating more finished images, finished illustrations, larger works, especially when they have a lot of detail, is our ability to plan. How much we spend time creating thumbnails or figuring out just what on earth we're doing with this image. But it's no easy task to figure out how much you should plan and how you should plan. What I want to do in this video is talk about what I like to call the 5% rule. And this is really simple. It's what it sounds like. You should probably spend at least 5% of your overall time creating art planning what that thing should be. Personally, this took me a long time to really get my head around. When I started out, I thought that thumbnails really equaled professional illustration and when you're going for some epic level of complexity and finish. But what I found is that this really relates to everything, and I found a lot of success applying it to even my sketchbook and just messing around. So what I want to do in this video is talk about how often the problem is that we're just not planning exactly the right amount for our artistic goals. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. So the problem is that often when we look at thumbnails and the idea of planning your images, you'll see a lot of stuff like this. And this is exactly right. This is Creative Illustration by Andrew Loomis, which I am always talking about on the channel because it's just a great example of how planning your illustrations was a major part of the everyday life of an illustrator, and it still is. This is what you will get trained to do if you take pretty much any course on illustration. And the idea of planning and doing thumbnails and ideation is also part of, look, pretty much every style of art. But often we do associate it with finished art, with a brief, with having to ideate. And maybe it doesn't apply quite so much, especially to beginners who aren't often exposed to this, to just the everyday art you do, to your sketching and your much simpler images. You can see here that this concept is repeated again and again, and one of the things that Andrew Loomis talks about in Creative Illustration is how you often do need to sort of plan things and iterate and mess around. And this is also one of the things that I find we can often get sidetracked with when it comes to illustration, is that thumbnails and planning are there for when you need to deal with clients and you need to do lots of iterations, you need to come up with ideas, but they're often less there for us to explore our own mind, our own ideas. And even if you have a very clear picture of what you want to do, the reality is that a thumbnail can be an excellent way of figuring out and doing those kind of first steps. So I think this is a really important point to understand, and it's one of the things that honestly I find so many students don't get about what it takes to create an illustration, or even what it takes to get an image from your imagination down onto the page. So as I said, one of the things that I found really helped actually was thumbnailing pretty much everything. And I think this can feel a little bit challenging early on if you're sort of thinking, hey, actually matching a thumbnail is no easy task. And this is true. It is a skill we need to build to be able to think in stages. But what I'd like to share with you through some examples as we sort of look at is how this is also something that gives you a lot of flexibility with your process and can actually enhance your creativity overall. And I think this is often really at the root cause of us being able to unlock those much more complicated, detailed illustrations. We often need to go to this level. And one of the other things that often is part of this kind of puzzle is that frequently we do kind of only practice thumbnails and matching a thumbnail and kind of that process of like, okay, I got a thumbnail, it's looking good, I like it, maybe the client has picked it, maybe I've picked it, maybe it's the only thumbnail I've created, like who knows, but how do I turn a thumbnail into a finished illustration of any kind? Or like, how do I turn a thumbnail into a more finished drawing or a more finished sketch or a speed painting or whatever you're doing? I think that there's a lot of focus these days because it's so fun to watch people kind of draw in this free-form manner without any planning on sort of TikTok or Instagram Reels, etc. It's a really fun idea, but I think the reality is a huge volume of great illustrations are planned, right? And they're often planned to quite a large degree, and there's a process to it. So this is one of the things I often teach, I think is so important to understand, is that illustration and drawing in itself are often steps. It's not just one process, it's many little processes, and the more reliable you can make this, the better. So to go back to what I was mentioning, what I kind of actually found is one of the best ways to practice this, if you're sort of saying like, okay, maybe it's intimidating to do a whole bunch of thumbnails for an illustration, and maybe you don't have and you don't want to spend your whole life doing 40-hour finished illustrations that you have this gigantic planning process to. This is where this concept of 5% really sort of clicked for me, and maybe understand that this is just a matter of, no matter what we're doing, giving ourselves the time and the space and the permission to plan it and to think about it. And the real trick here, where this can really help your entire artistic game, is that as you practice creating little plans, little sketches for even your sketches or your sketchbook images, or just kind of something you're going to spend like half an hour on, like whatever it is, something that's more in that kind of speed art realm. Practicing spending a little bit of time planning that, and I think 5% is a great little kind of target to aim for, will help you also when it comes to creating larger, more complicated illustrations. Because as I said, art is created through a process, and the more you can get used to your process, the more reliable and easy it is for you to understand that. And the more you get used to saying, okay, here's a thumbnail. How do I make that into a finished illustration? How do I make that into a more detailed drawing? To think about the process that you use to do that. The more you can do that, I think the better everything else gets. So let's take a closer look at some examples of this and how we can see this play out depending on whether you want to create a cover for a published book that needs to be as perfect as you can possibly make it, or if you're just kind of messing around and saying like, hey, I've got 2.5 hours, what can I make? How can I make a good plan for that? What I've found in general is that if the thumbnail is good, and this is advice that goes back through the ages, right, is that if the thumbnail is good, often everything is like a snowball rolling downhill. It's really easy versus it being like you're pushing a rock uphill. Now, there's lots of artists who I feel like have built a career and certainly an online presence around drawing automatically. The late Kim Jung-gi is one of the best examples of this, and what he is doing is really sort of magical. It is a performance art, and a lot of people do really enjoy drawing that way. I think that's admirable, but the reality is, I would say far more illustrators and far more people also who are more focused on creating finished illustrations with a higher level of polish, where maybe it does need to sort of be painted and you really sort of need to take it to that next level, is that there is a process. It's an illustration process, and you go from A to B, and there's often multiple steps, even with the drawing, where we refine the idea, the construction, the methodology, etc. So what I found is that having a good thumbnail often improves everything. And this is something where I often play around with this. I often do these little 2-hour, 3-hour images. If you're a fan of the Drawing Codex channel, you know that I'm often doing these live, right? In these art ritual videos where we just kind of start and see what happens. And what I find is, as you can see here, even though the image kind of ended up being flipped, is this was the little sketchbook drawing that I did in my sketchbook to kind of plan for this image. And this wasn't necessarily something where I had this epic idea for like, oh, I've got exactly this picture in my head. I was just kind of thinking about like what's an interesting way to compose a character or figure? And, I'm just sort of responding to the shapes on an abstract level. I'm trying to think about, oh, this is a nice sort of triangular shape that's created here. I'm just going to have the character centered, like, oh, what could be behind them? Oh, this creates an interesting shape. And I was kind of messing around and playing around, but like I'm having a plan and I'm sort of working through and trying to understand those initial concepts of like, where's the figure? What kind of composition am I having here now? Again, I haven't really figured out whether or not the character is dark or light against the background. This is not a refined thumbnail by any means, but just kind of spending 5 minutes, 10 minutes on that thumbnail process. If you're going to spend 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on an image, will make a huge difference, because you can really create a solid plan in 5 or 10 minutes for sort of what you want to do. And I think once you get used to incorporating this idea into your process, you can kind of relax a little bit, because you're like, okay, I got the idea. It's just a matter of sort of stepping through that sort of nice process. So here's another example though, and this is often where maybe this doesn't have to be the most polished illustration, but often, as you saw with those Andrew Loomis examples, one of the things we're trying to do is design not just the art, but also how the art interacts with design elements. So this was the cover design for a board game, tabletop game called Mythic Arcana that I sort of did on Kickstarter with my friend Tony Go quite a number of years ago now. And this is a great example where, and this is an example of where, like, yeah, I still spent that like 5% of the time planning it. But the planning is not always about drawing. It's a matter of position. Like, where on the cover does this thing go? And this is one of the things that will really separate you as a professional illustrator from someone who's just kind of making art, is that often we do need to kind of position our art in a very particular place. You need to kind of design that, as we see here, so that it kind of felt well with the logo and with the extra additional information that we had. Like, you needed to put these, how many players, age range, like how long it actually takes to play, who made it, the website, etc. We sort of needed to mock that up. And that then needs to kind of stay pretty locked in. And this is where the power of thumbnailing and ideation can really help you. And I guess the idea here is, if I build this muscle here of saying, hey, I'm just making art, I'm just messing around, like there's not much pressure. If I just build this muscle of saying, let's make a thumbnail, let's plan this a little bit more. If I do it here, then it means doing this is much more effortless, and I can really play around and experiment. Because one of the things you'll find, and again, let me know in the comments down below whether this step feels like, hey, dude, you're missing a step, right? It's tricky to take a thumbnail and figure out how to make it into a finished illustration. Again, it is. Let me know if you want me to sort of go into that in more detail in a follow-up video or something like that. But that certainly is its own challenge, and that's part of having a reliable process. But there's many good strategies for that. And I think if you practice and build this muscle, it makes doing these things quite a lot easier. The other way that I find this will really kind of help you is if you do need to figure out a lot of tonal plans or color plans. So here I got a tutorial that is part of the Line and Color Academy, which is where I sort of talk people through and sort of teach how to create comic book style illustrations like I do. And this is an example of how we can actually progress the thumbnail or the planning phase and say, this is probably going to be a 20 to 25 hour illustration. This is something where it is going to be a cover. But it's kind of just for me, right? I'm not necessarily going to create 10 million different thumbnails, but I do really want to make sure that as I step through the process of creating this, that this is a reliable way of making art, and I'm spending that time in the beginning really figuring out where I'm going to go. And that means it's so much more relaxing to finish those last steps. So you can see here, I had that kind of rough idea that is similar to these, some of these kind of other sketches, I guess, that we've done over here, right? This one and this one. It's a rough idea, but then what happens is I take it to a whole nother level where essentially we do a lot of the drawing, and I also mock up and think about how's the value arrangement work here. Because this is a line and color illustration, but it has a lot of tonality, it's rendered, and I need to figure out a lot of the stuff that will end up in that finished image. For instance, we got some of those interesting silhouettes where the character is darker than the background behind them, where these like little bug creatures from the forest are giving us a nice little interesting silhouette. So thinking about the overlapping of shapes and how we sort of plan the tonality there is really, really important. And so those are the kind of things that if you're spending 25 hours on an illustration or image, you probably want to spend, 1 hour at least, really figuring out like what's going to be going on with that kind of initial plan. Now, again, 5% I think is just a good rule of thumb, but certainly if you're really trying to create something polished, you can spend more, right? You could spend sort of 10% and that will make things much more reliable, much more relaxed. But I think 5% is the minimum, right? It's sort of rarely, you don't want to be going any less than that. But it's often these steps here that allow me to create the level of polish. And this is often the case when you're stepping through that phase and saying, okay, like how do I take that thumbnail to the next stage? You often do have next stages where you can no longer really tell what or whether or not the image is working. So here I can tell I've got the character's emotion, the mood, the rendering. We're seeing the lighting and how that supports the composition. Often you have a bit in the middle of your process where things are kind of a bit ugly. Doesn't matter what your process is. It could be line and color. It could be painted. It could be 3D, whatever it is. There's always a bit in the middle somewhere where things are a bit ugly and you're like, I don't even know if this is going to work. Having that plan is often what will anchor you and keep you sort of pushing forward and often allow you to add the finishing last little mile of it that will make all the difference. So this is where if you're spending that kind of 20 hours on an image, yeah, an hour to do the thumbnail is totally reasonable. Probably more will actually kind of serve you pretty well. But certainly any less than that, and you can see that you're just going to sort of run into trouble. Now, I find that often what happens with students that I see where we sort of see major kind of frustration here is that often we kind of start with a fairly vague thumbnail and then you think like, okay, I'm off to the races. I'm going to go. And you kind of spend 5 hours and you're like, oh, this is kind of looking pretty good. But the real problem here is to understand what is the finished result that you actually need and to understand that you need to create a good foundation underneath that drawing with your planning to support the level of detail you want. And so people will kind of say, hey, this is looking pretty good. I'll just clean it up. But often we're not always quite sure how to clean it up. And I know that a lot of people kind of get stuck towards that middle to the end of their process with their image because they just didn't kind of add that extra level of planning and thumbnailing and figuring out exactly where everything was going to go and how the elements of their image, like does it have tonality? Does it have color? Does this need to have a lot of dynamism? What is the mood? Like, is the mood of this image really critical to its success? Or is it just something where like, you can kind of play around with it? Knowing that you are going to spend that extra time will often save you a huge amount of time because once you do get to the end, if you kind of have a couple of things that are maybe off that you haven't thought about, where you're like, actually, I've got a dark character against a dark background, right? I mean, how many times does that happen? Yeah, you can't see it. It's no good. So just figuring out those basic things will make sure we're not backtracking, right? So let me show you the last little example I have here, which is me doing my Pinocchio cover. And this is sort of the finished result, right? And we have a finished professional cover that had, sort of logos. It was printed. It had gold foil on it. It kind of turned out really well. And looking at sort of how many different options were sort of chosen there was pretty crazy, right? This is probably where this was way more than 5% because we really needed to make sure that this was right. And this is where probably these last two examples I'm giving you are more similar to the sort of professional illustration or the processes where you see people using thumbnails. And this really is why you would need to do that. It's not like back here, right, where you're just trying to plan a little image for yourself. It's where you're really trying to say, hey, this needs to be the perfect image. This needs to be the best one I can do. I need to leave no stone unturned. I need to explore a bunch of different ideas with the editor, with the publisher. And, often even sometimes these covers will go to the book sellers, and the booksellers will kind of look at the cover and say like, do you think that'll sell? Is it a good enough cover? So the cover can often make or break a project like this. And it's often a major part of the marketing. So it kind of needs to be right. You can see here, I went through a whole bunch of different variations. I still feel like I want to one day make this cover because I never got to do it, but I thought it was like so emblematic of the Pinocchio journey and all the sort of different characters. And I really like this one. But this one, we didn't sort of pick it, right? And these are the the reasons that you would use a much more detailed sort of process. I need to do a video that is just me sort of walking through the Pinocchio process. Again, let me know in the comments down below whether you sort of want to see me just walking through this cover. But here you can see I did some different sort of color variations on it, which are often there to just kind of think about the mood. But here's all the other ideas that I did for this, where, you know, Pinocchio is looking at himself as a reflection, that we can see all the different characters in all sorts of different ways. And I also played with this idea of creating something very simple, because you can sort of think about like, hey, this is really cool. I did more drawing. I created a cool scene, and like that must be very valuable. But like, part of me was like, maybe something like this would be good. You know, like maybe just really simple little Pinocchio there. Maybe that would sell better. Maybe that would be more impactful. Maybe it would make it feel more mature. Who knows, right? These are the explorations that we do and experiment and play around with. So there you can kind of see, again, the range of different ideas that we kind of tried. All these different ideas about, like, maybe it's just Pinocchio and he's just kind of swimming in the ocean, and you can kind of see the light rays coming from above, like refracting through the ocean, and you can kind of just see the eyes, right, of the giant sort of shark creature thingy. Again, I always forget what it is. It's very differently represented in different different versions of Pinocchio. But even when we sort of chose this one, what I did is, again, sort of iterate so many different sort of versions of it, right? So I needed to play around with, okay, is he facing the camera? Is he facing here? Just those little decisions made such a huge difference. And it was really only after exploring all those that I was able to have the confidence to commit to what was a very, very lengthy process of creating a finished illustration for this image. There we go. Now, here's that finished image. Again, I always just like to show this in person, in physicality, because it's really tricky to know what it actually looks like when you're seeing it just on a screen. But this was something that took a lot of effort and thought to really get to some point where, you know, we knew it was going to have gold foil. I was thinking about what colors go with gold. How do we kind of refine that? There was also probably like, you know, 20 different versions of the logo font, right, that we kind of explored and played around with. But I feel like often when we're starting out, we think, hey, I'm not doing professional illustration like that. I'm just kind of messing around, and that planning process is not for me. And it is certainly a big burden to plan and think about something that much. But I really think you can learn a lot and build your illustration skills and allow yourself to play with composition, with color theory, with tonal patterns, to really think about what makes a good image by building this muscle of planning, of thumbnailing. So if you're just spending 10 minutes on a little sketch, do a smaller, sketchier sketch in 30 seconds. You know, just sort of plan things out. Get into that habit of kind of thinking about this. If you're going to spend half an hour on something, you're just kind of sketching around, let's spend a couple of minutes thinking, what am I doing? What's the point of this? How's this composition work? Is this going to work, right? Again, pick something simple and you'll often find it'll work pretty well. But really, this will help you when you're trying to create something that does have more polish. The beauty of planning things is it allows you to relax and kind of know, okay, I have some idea where I'm going, and now I just have to get there. And the thing that will allow you to take the pressure off and just work on the surface of the painting, the brush strokes, the lost and found edges, the subtleties, the emotion you put into the lines, and also to just make sure you're doing all the right technical things. You're stepping through the image properly. You're putting things on the right layers in Photoshop. You're just doing everything in a really logical, professional way. The way that you build those skills is to kind of take the load off you as you are thinking about the image and stepping through it, right? If we have a plan, it means we're better able to think about anatomy and construction and proportion and getting everything right. We're not sort of trying to do those two things at once. And we're also not stopping halfway through or all of the way through, or like 95 or often 99% of the way there, because we're just not quite sure where we're going or whether this is going to end up doing anything. It's so easy to become disheartened when you don't have a plan, especially if you pick up an image halfway through. You know, you kind of set it down, you take a break, you come back to it after a weekend or a week, and then you're like, what was I even doing? And if you have a plan for that, it often allows you to pick that image up and work on it later. But these are skills that are fundamentally built just by practicing this idea. So give this one a shot. Let me know in the comments down below whether this lands for you, whether you like this idea. And if you have a chance to explore this, again, come back and leave me a comment. If you want to see me draw a whole bunch of thumbnails, again, in a very different context, thinking about keyframe illustration and where we're ideating a whole bunch of different stuff, check out this video, because again, in that one, I draw quite a few different thumbnails.